Ollie, tell us briefly who you are and what you do.
Hey Milan, so my name's Oli Genn-Bash. I am the fungi consultant, and my passion is in functional mushrooms, mushrooms in general, mycelial web. I consult organizations and individuals on the best ways to implement functional mushrooms into their lives.
Perfect, perfect. Can you, I mean, your work is deeply personal. Can you share a key moment where mushrooms have changed your life?
I would say the key moment has come from my experiences with the psychedelic fungi. Certainly, quite powerful, mind-opening experiences, really connecting me with nature, connecting me with the wider world of fungi. And that has allowed me to really get involved with the functional mushrooms and particularly utilizing them for dealing with physical health conditions has been a major turning point in my life.
So, how have you used mushrooms to deal with physical health conditions? I'm sure there are a lot of listeners out there that are also struggling with health. So many people are. And what was your entry point for that? How did you start out and how did you manage to incorporate mushrooms and what have you achieved with that?
Yeah, so the psychedelic mushrooms again have been quite useful in providing me with experiences that have allowed me to experience nature in a different way, but also the functional mushrooms like lion's mane and cordyceps that have allowed me to improve my cognitive function, engage with energy in a more positive way, have really allowed me to develop an exercise routine, which has been for me personally the core of my health and wellness, which it seems like an obvious thing, but it's something that's actually taken quite a long time for
Mm.
me to get to, where I can naturally build that exercise routine, that movement as the starting point for building a good regime for health. And the functional mushrooms have been really key, cordyceps in particular, allowing me to tap into those extra energy sources. It's become my favorite mushroom because of that reason, being so related to exercise.
It's so interesting. I mean, it's kind of, I don't feel like it's being talked about enough, this effect that mushrooms can have that they allow us to adjust our habits. And I think it's important because changing habits is something that we all want to do to some extent, right? That we all, as we grow and mature in life, we find that, hey, I should be exercising more, or I need to sort out my sleep patterns. And so having a tool that can help us adjust our habits is it's really amazing. It really does make something that's very difficult uh, easier for people, even though I think that aspect of mushrooms is very difficult to kind of measure and assess scientifically, but it's something that you can experience as you work with them, right, as an individual. Um, just a little bit more on your background. You co-founded the Psychedelic Society at the University of Kent. Can you give us a bit more color behind that and what drove you to do that and what came out of that work?
Yes, so I've not really thought about that for a long time in terms of what drove me. It was the personal experiences with psychedelics. And interestingly, I was playing some music at the time, round about 2009, 2010, and the name of the band was named after the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I'd never heard of this thing before. That the people that I joined this band were into Tibetan Buddhism, and then they mentioned to me about the book The Psychedelic Experience, which was by Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzner. And that was modeled on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol. And I found that quite interesting to have quite a spiritual framework for looking at the psychedelic experience, looking at it through this lens of the different stages of reincarnation within Tibetan Buddhism. And that I guess it turned me on to the academic inquiry surrounding psychedelics. I really enjoyed the experiential side, but looking at, I guess you could call it psychedelic spirituality, psychedelic philosophy, people sharing their thoughts about their experiences in books. To me, it was eye-opening to realize that, oh wow, there's a whole field of psychedelic literature and academia, not like it is today, but real beginnings or a re-renaissance of research that had been happening in the 50s and 60s and was starting to happening again in the early 2000s. And it felt like a really pivotal time. And then I met up with someone who my bandmate introduced me to, and they had already written a small book. I think they were 19 years old at the time, small book on psychedelics, and I found it really interesting. And this guy, Dave King, seemed like a psychedelic whiz kid, and quite quickly we decided that we should set up a society where we would bring people together to talk about these things. And we had backing from the Anthropology Society, some key lecturers there, and we did it quite academically. We didn't have any social events or anything like
Mm.
that. We didn't want to draw too much interest to it as a society connected to drugs. It was more about the inquiry, the spirituality, philosophy, and the science behind it.
I think it's really interesting that the psychedelic experience has that you've connected that to one of the wisdom books and this
Mm.
ancient wisdom that we have. And I think that's really a powerful gateway to knowledge that we should probably be looking at, in a society where a lot of people feel lost and there's this sense of a lack of meaning or purpose, and then reconnecting to this ancient wisdom. So this is a new connection for me that that the psychedelics can actually point to that. But it looks like all of these profound mystical experiences that we can have kind of tie back to a deeper source, and that is the source that these books then also spring from, right? Whether it's the Tibetan Book of the Dead or the Bible or the I Ching in China, works like that. Um, so, I mean, your story speaks to resilience and transformation, and that resonates with our audience. Many of the people that come to us at Mycelium Hub are navigating stress and they're navigating fatigue. And as I was saying, they have this search for deeper meaning. So having grounding tools that actually work is really powerful. But we're also doing that from the perspective of, the right framework, having the right mindset and the right circumstance around that. It's not as you were saying in a previous talk, a molecular solution. It's just like take a pill to be better, right? Which is more of a Brave New World approach to things. Um, the world of like moving into functional mushrooms, the world of functional mushrooms is still very new and still quite misunderstood. And a lot of the work that you're doing currently is around educating people in that space. What are the biggest myths that people believe around functional mushrooms?
I think the biggest myths are that they won't really do anything, i.e., you won't necessarily notice them, and it will be a a slow build up in the system to where eventually you'll feel like, hey, these are doing something, and I feel a bit sharper or a bit more energized. I think that's a myth. The other myth is that unfortunately just eating or consuming dried mushroom powder will have any real benefits. Similarly, the other myth is consuming these mushrooms in a culinary sense will give you really any of the same benefits as taking them in supplement form.
Okay. Thanks for sharing. I think that's some very practical stuff, and we can dive into that in a
Yeah,
bit more detail as we move on. Um, there is money to be made. It is kind of a new gold rush in that space, and so perhaps that contributes to the noise in the space. And so my question to you is, if people are in the health food store or increasingly even in the supermarket and they're trying to choose a product to use functional mushrooms to gain some kind of benefit, what are some ways that people can use to cut through the noise? Are there some markers or some signals that they can look for? What's your take on that?
absolutely. It really is a minefield. If I go to a health food store, there's at, at least five different brands, maybe 20 different products, all different variations. So I'm quite clear in that I think you need to have a mushroom extract. The main reason being that mushrooms, the cell walls, are made up of something called chitin. Chitin's in vegetables, it's also in the shells of insects. So it's quite tough material, and our stomachs have a tough time breaking it down. There are some benefits to chitin. It does have a prebiotic effect in the gut, but in order to obtain the beneficial compounds which the mushrooms are being touted for, we need to be able to access them. And a lot of them are water soluble and alcohol soluble. So without doing a hot water extraction or an alcohol extraction, or ideally both,
Mm.
it's quite difficult to actually obtain the benefits. The other thing that we see quite a lot on the mushroom supplements is a ratio. Often it will say something like 15 to 1, 10 to 1. That is a good marker to look out for. A lot of the time, something might say a mushroom extract, but not actually say a ratio. Now, the ratio means how much of the starting material has been used to make an extract. So 15 to 1 is 15 kilos has made 1 kilo of extract, 15 kilos of raw starting material. And there's some discrepancy there in terms of what that actually means. So I tend to say to people, you want to look for a lower ratio because what that means is the quality of your starting material is higher because the active compounds are going to be in a greater concentration because you've actually needed to use less. So I look for 8 to 1, 4 to 1 extract ratios. Sometimes you'll see it the opposite way round. When it's made into a liquid extract, it will be a 1 to 4. That means for every 1 mil, there's 4 mils of extract in there. So you have some companies doing it like that. But that small ratio, from what I understand from speaking to different mushroom companies, it's the
Mm.
lower ratios you want to look for. But then the conversation's moved further on from that, in that really want to look for active compounds. So does it say measurements of things like terpenes in reishi or cordycepin in cordyceps? These are really good markers. Obviously, I always look for organic. Mushrooms take up a lot of heavy metals. They're really good at soil remediation. So you want to make sure whatever substrate they're growing on hasn't got nasty stuff in it. And obviously, being tested at the very least for heavy metals. And if you can actually have lab tests showing the concentration of compounds, that's really good. Those are all the things that for me tick the gold standard, or what I think should be happening with the industry.
That's great. You've actually answered one of the questions that I had as you were talking, which is,
Okay.
can you actually look for the active compounds themselves and look at, this much of that compound per milliliter or per gram or something like that. So do you see that as an emerging, information that more and more products are kind of referring directly to the concentration of the active compound, or is it not that straightforward?
I think it will be. I think from speaking to people in the industry, that's where things are moving. Because, for example, if we take something like lion's mane, which is touted for its brain boosting benefits and from the research, we can see that there's a compound called erinacin A, which has a lot of potential for this nerve growth factor, growing new brain cells, growing, strengthening the nerve cells. So if a company can actually test for that, it's a difficult situation because you can't say this product will help with your Alzheimer's and grow your new brain cells. All you can say is this product contains, for example, however many milligrams per gram of erinacin A, and then you can also put out the information saying what the benefits of that are. The way I see it is, unfortunately, the testing at the moment is quite expensive. So what seems to be the gold standard test is something called high performance thin layer chromatography. And that allows you to test for the specific compounds. So, for example, something like erinacin A in lion's mane, ganideric acid A in reishi. The test that's sort of one step removed from that, you can test for the class of compounds. So, for example, you can test for the terpenes in reishi. So then at least you can put on your product contains 6% terpenes. That gives you some benefit in terms of marketing your product in a way that's going to give people a bit more trust. And I think the way things are moving, information like polysaccharides and beta glucans seems to become less relevant. All mushrooms contain beta glucans. You can also fudge the numbers with your testing because you could add some rice starch and that will show up as a higher test for polysaccharides, and or you could add maltodextrin to your mushroom extract powder that will test quite high for polysaccharides. So it
Mm.
doesn't necessarily mean anything unless you're testing for the specific compounds.
Okay, and just for the listeners that aren't so familiar, what would be the benefits of polysaccharides and beta glucans?
Yeah, so polysaccharide. So beta glucan is probably the most common polysaccharide. Polysaccharide just means many sugars. It's a long sugar chain that our bodies can't break down. So that's the reason why it doesn't taste sweet. And because our bodies don't break it down, it seems to have a prebiotic effect on our gut bacteria. And where all mushrooms, it seems, even from the common button mushroom all the way to chaga and turkey tail with their immunomodulatory benefits, they all seem to do something interesting in the gut and helping with the immune system from the starting point of the gut. So that seems to be really where, immunomodulatory, anti-cancer properties, in a lot of these popular mushrooms at the moment.
That's really insightful. Thanks for sharing that. And I think it's specifically relevant now that more and more people are starting to acknowledge and science is starting to take note of, the foundations of health being connected to gut health and what's going on in the gut. So if we can support our gut microbiome, which a lot of mushrooms seem to do, then we can improve our overall health and well-being, including even mental health from some studies that I've come across that, it's rather than taking powerful psychopharmaca, you could actually look at your gut health and achieve some positive outcomes, or to do that in combination with those drugs where that's possible. In your opinion, what's the biggest gap in mushroom education today, looking at the general public that's wanting to benefit from this emergent economy?
I think the personalized aspect, knowing actually what mushroom you should be taking. Because from my experience, what I see when I go into health food shops is lion's mane is always the one which is going out of stock the fastest, which suggests that everyone has cognitive issues, which doesn't really seem likely for society that every single person is just going for this one. Okay, this store has to keep reordering lion's mane because we've got an epidemic of problems with dementia, and maybe that is the case. But I do think something like lion's mane gained a lot of popularity because of the cognitive enhancing benefits. And hey, who doesn't want to have cognitive enhancement? But it might not necessarily be the right mushroom for you. There might be other mushrooms that suit you better that you can use in a tailored, targeted way. So I think as well, a lot of there's a lot of gaps when it comes to the variety of mushrooms. I think
Mm.
we tend to focus on maybe just a few in in places like the UK, but if you go to China, people are talking about hundreds of different types of mushrooms. So
So would you say that in China they've got a much longer history of dealing with incorporating mushrooms into healthcare and using functional or health supporting mushrooms?
I think certainly from it it does seem historically, if we're just looking at the years of certified use, it does seem that China has historically some of the longest usage of mushrooms. But then if we're actually looking at the systemic ways that they're being incorporated into healthcare, into actual pharmacopoeias, where it's being brought into the traditional Chinese medicine system of looking at tonifying and curative and preventative and strengthening and adapting, it does seem like they are quite far ahead of other countries. I've been looking
Mhm.
into more Western use of mushrooms, and it's quite limited to things like chaga and birch polypore. So there doesn't seem that much of a rich history of use, but
So just to get back to your previous point regarding the lion's mane, I think a lot of people might have that idea from that movie, and I think it was also a series, Limitless, where this new compound gets discovered, and it's a pharmaceutical compound, and this guy takes it and becomes much smarter and kind of levels up in life, and achieves a breakthrough. I think a lot of people would love to have that, and so maybe that's where that demand is driven from. It's like I can increase my IQ levels or something like that. So, but to follow up on what you said after that, also, do you see something emerging, or maybe it doesn't exist yet, but that there's a kind of assessment which helps people then decide which functional mushrooms to take? Or is that something that you perhaps want to have some input on?
yeah, that's certainly where I'm going with my education personally for myself and for other people, providing consultations where it is really trying to understand what is someone's existing health regime, what supplements are they already taking, what supplements have they tried, where have things worked, where have things not worked. And I think there's a lot of promise for people being able to build a regime just with functional mushrooms, not having to necessarily, and it might sound a bit evangelical, and I do like other adaptogens and nootropics, but I think it's really interesting to note how I guess where in the hierarchy in things like traditional Chinese medicine, where these mushrooms sit. And it's important to take notice, okay, can we really use them in a strategic way to help build a routine that is right for me? For example, myself at the moment, I'm just using cordyceps because that allows me to be really targeted and understand, okay, what's happening when I take it, what's happening when I don't take it. And that allows me to then just build that routine and understand where I really need to use it, what times of day is it going to be really beneficial.
That's really good to know. I came across a functional mushroom concept around the importance to cycle through functional mushrooms to prevent the body from adapting and the impact being lost. What's your take on that idea?
Yeah, I've not. come across that so much. I would say there's possibly something to do with certain mushrooms and balancing of hormones. You have a similar thing with other adaptogens like ginseng and maca. Often it's recommended to take them for a month and take a break from them to let your hormones balance out. So I think certain people with certain conditions do need to be careful about which mushroom they're choosing. I think, yeah, as with a lot of things, that's probably the case where your body will build up a tolerance, so to speak, to a particular mushroom, and you might not notice the benefits so much. I don't necessarily know if there's too many negative side effects. Traditional Chinese medicine says eat mushrooms every day for the rest of your life. I don't know how clear it is about cycling them and changing them up. I think in terms of building a routine, building a regime or around these mushrooms, then it might be useful to take something for a little bit and then switch it up and see what happens if I start taking lion's mane for focus rather than relying on cordyceps for energy to get me stimulated for the day and engaged. Different ways of managing the day, I guess.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I just wanted to share a
Oh,
functional
wow.
mushroom that we've been harvesting.
Amazing.
For those listening, I'm holding up a chaga, and we've been managing to find quite a few. And yeah, it's a treasure of the Nordic forests where we are, and you kind of develop an eye for it, right? But with the chaga, it's also got certain anti-nutrients, meaning
Yeah.
you shouldn't really go crazy with it. The oxalates, I think,
Hmm.
that you should like. How do you navigate that? For example, with chaga, that people should take it for the healing effects for a time and then give it a rest. Take it for a week and then off for 3 weeks. Or how do you navigate dealing with those anti-nutrients in the case of chaga?
From what I understand, there's ways to balance these things out. So I consume quite a lot of raw cacao, which can be quite high in oxalates. I a lot of the time will consume it with tahini, which is quite high in calcium. So the calcium allows your body to break down the oxalates so they don't build up too much in the system. So I think there are ways to mitigate it, but from what I understand with chaga, it does have a higher concentration of oxalates compared to other mushrooms. I think because it's so fibrous in nature. So possibly there's ways of refining it. If you're doing an extraction with chaga, then maybe you're mitigating some of that added effect. I don't know if there's a difference maybe in terms of the oxalate buildup if you're having chaga in a tea compared to if you're having an alcohol extract. So there might be some difference there. There might be, that is the benefit of refining and processing things is that you can take out unwanted, unnecessary compounds that might build up in your system.
Mm. I like that idea that, we could forage something from nature and then apply craftsmanship to, adapt it even further to our needs. I mean, for us, this has been a game changer because part of what we do is to host people here and take them into nature to forage. And the mushrooms that you can forage also in winter months is, there's chaga, there's birch polypore, which has
Mhm.
also been really interesting. And we've been using the birch polypore when we get a bit of a cold coming on and we drink that tea. And I have been a little bit sick this winter, but it was only for a brief period. It was for a few days, and I was drinking birch polypore to help with that. Um, but I like the idea of teaching people which healing and functional mushrooms they can forage, and then the process of going in and finding them. allows them to look at the landscape in a more mindful way, you know. And there's this interesting phenomenon of, and I'm sure you've encountered that as a mushroom enthusiast, before you know about something, you can't really see it. And it's been so interesting for me to learn about birch polypore. And I never saw that. I never noticed it. And now when I walk around and I see a dead birch tree and say, oh, look, there's a birch polypore, right?
Mhm.
Super interesting. But it's, again, it helps us be that knowing that there's this powerful medicine out there that we can access. And I've been blown away by what birch polypore can do, as an example.
Yeah,
Um,
it's incredible.
yeah, it gives us the motivation, but then it draws us out into nature and then look around with an open eye and see more and be more connected. So it's a really nice healing and reconnecting process of doing that. Um, I wanted to ask you now a bit about decentralized learning. What, because this is coming back more to the mycelial perspective, right? The wisdom of the mycelium, and what can we learn from these ancient networks that connect all of the different beings in the forest and allow trees to talk to each other, and they allow information and resources to be traded. Um, how do you see mycelial approach shaping education and community, for example?
It's interesting to think about modeling our human systems on the mycelium. I was talking to someone yesterday about the Aboriginal dream time, where people would enter into. We were talking about it in relation to DMT, and is it this different place that people enter into to learn about things in a different way? And I lived in Australia for a year in my 20s, and I made friends with someone who was an educator, and he was quite into Aboriginal ways of learning in this non-didactic way where, okay, you're entering into the dream time, you're learning about the different beings in this space, but the beings in this space are related to the land and the processes and the systems, and where there's Aboriginals, particularly living in the center of Australia, who know where to find water, know where to find food, know how to do all of these things that they've learned from entering into these spaces which are more connected to the land, understanding how to manage bushfires. It's a big point of contention in Australia. When the white settlers came in, the bushfires started increasing because they didn't know how to manage the land properly and they weren't listening to the Aboriginals. So, this idea of the mycelial web of engaging in ways of understanding and communication which aren't based around our human language, but based around biochemical exchanges and understanding where resources are needed and where they can be taken to, where you can help, where you might not be able to help, not trying to dominate the situation and just put your map onto something. You're actually allowing the biosphere to map what you do and realize that when you're working with these natural systems, things might take a bit longer, but it's kind of optimal. You eventually reach something which works in favor of everything. And as much as nature is competitive and we talk about survival of the fittest, it doesn't necessarily, from my perspective, I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but it doesn't seem like something is taking too much and something is not getting enough. There does seem to be equilibrium, resources are shifted around, things work in their weird way which we don't necessarily understand, but there's some degree of balance. So I think if we're then modeling educational systems or the way in which we structure a business, the way in which we organize working scenarios, where we're not trying to necessarily reach a set target, we're seeing what emerges from people coming together in a non-hierarchical way, in a decentralized way that appreciates the input of everything.
Well, there's so much there that I could follow up on. I think I really like your point about the dream time and other trance practices, whether they're psychedelic or not, and people reach these states in different ways. But in indigenous societies, um, they, the shamanic practices have been used to navigate another perspective on reality, which is what you're saying is there is another truth out there that's outside of the conscious rational mind that these practices allow shamans to go to those places and then take back something that actually is the case, right? It's an intuitive knowing. It's a kind of non-ego way of knowing. And I think part of what makes that possible with the psychedelic experience is that it kind of destroys the ego, right? It kind of shuts down that, hey, look at me, I know everything, and I'm kind of a big deal. It's like, no, you sit down, you take your place, and you just kind of, it's such a powerful experience. You just need to take it all in, and it kind of teaches respect and interconnectedness. And yeah, it's kind of this default system. What do you call it? The default network, right? That
Yeah,
gets
default
a
mode
ration.
network.
Exactly. Mode network gets kind of turned off, and you can access a different reality. And that's where I think maybe not so much anymore, but I think science and kind of the mechanistic scientific perspective would tend to say, well, that's just molecules firing off, and you're having these kind of illusions. And whereas these indigenous cultures are saying, no, there is another place that you can go to, and it's just as real and just as true in some senses as what the rational mind can perceive, right? Um, how do you, I think, just to kind of continue from what we've discussed around functional mushrooms, you're you've got a lot of knowledge in that area, and I see that you've been starting to really reach more people, and we're connecting on LinkedIn and chatting there, and you're really blowing up there. So it's great to see. Um, you're putting together some information or like some services. Like, what are you working on to kind of share this knowledge more widely? Do you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm working on a toolkit because I do think there are some problems in the functional mushroom industry. I think it's an emerging industry which has it's simultaneously blown up while it's still in its infancy. So there's a lot of companies with good marketing budgets which have already been involved in the wellness space, which then put out some products, and their brand is often what is carrying that product. And I think people have jumped on the hype and people are spending a lot of money. And I think there is a lot of confusion when it comes to what makes a good functional mushroom product and also how to really use them. Depending on the type of person that you are, how can you really utilize these products to benefit the areas of your life where you might have been trying lots of different supplements and you think something's been working, but actually, can you get to the point where you're really understanding that this mushroom is key to optimizing your health? So, yeah, bringing people into that space, helping them to understand where the actual gaps in the knowledge are, because there's a lot of unknown unknowns.
Yeah, that is part of the problem. Like, I don't even know what I don't know, I don't know which questions to ask. I feel like this has been kind of a theme here from talking to you and you sharing your knowledge. It's like I see you as having this pivotal role in helping people ask the right questions when they're trying to incorporate mushrooms into their life. And so I'm really excited about seeing some of your upcoming offerings where you can educate people And it's not just, I don't like the word consumers. Let's say people who use mushrooms, people who want to buy mushroom products. I think it also extends to people who are promoting mushroom products, people who are manufacturing them, and kind of making sure that people don't get blinded by the dollar signs and stay on track, keeping people honest if you want. So I think you helping people ask the right questions, um, in itself has a great effect of keeping manufacturers honest, that then the public come to them and say, "Hey, have you done this?" Or, "Hey, I don't like that you've said this on your packaging because it's a bit deceptive. Like, can you give us the real data?" So I think it's important work because it seems like in this mycelial fungal industry, let's say, the standards and the frameworks are still emerging. And as you said earlier, due to the lack of broad-based scientific studies, it's very difficult to make health claims, right? You can't really um, say, "Hey, this is going to heal your so-and-so condition" when you sell a mushroom product.
Yeah, it's a real problem. I say it's a problem. It's a double-edged sword, I think, of regulations because you don't want to have snake oil salesmen on street corners saying this will cure XYZ. You're not allowed to do that, and that's fair enough. What it means is then it has to be quite a slow process of getting the right information out there about what these mushrooms can actually do for people. And then when people understand the terminology and understand what to look for, then eventually they'll be able to make the right choices.
That's a fair point. Do you see a place for certification frameworks like, Mushroom Council of the UK approved, something like that? Or are you involved in such emergent frameworks even?
I have been sort of, and interestingly, there's something called the Functional Mushroom Council, which exists in the US. I sent them an email a few days ago saying, hey, I'd be interested in trying to set something up like this in the UK. There has been some talk from an organization called the Cannabis Trades Association, who have primarily dealt with CBD. And now that a few major CBD companies are shifting into the functional mushroom space, the Cannabis Trades Association have said, well, we need to set up some kind of trade association body in order to deal with the Food Standards Authority. I don't know where that is at the moment. I was tentatively advising that didn't progress into anything. So I feel like myself, I'm doing something of a good job there. My plan with this toolkit is if there are mushroom companies who want to get involved and be promoted in this toolkit where okay, if your products are up to a certain standard, which is not just me setting the standard on my own, it's actually looking at different parameters and explaining why it is really going in depth, why it is that these parameters should be on a functional mushroom product, then and I've spoken to other companies in the functional mushroom space where it would be good to have something like Vegan Society, Soil Associated stamp of approval where okay, it's been tested for heavy metals, it's organic.
Hmm.
At the very least, it's been tested for active compounds, it hasn't got fillers, it's been extracted using these methods, and it has that traceability and trust because what I've seen with the CBD industry is it's sort of collapsing on itself, where
Hmm.
you had too many cheap products being put out on the market and people started to lose trust, I think, and things became too cheap and the industry couldn't actually hold itself up to a certain standard. So I don't want the same thing to happen with functional mushrooms. I think there are some brilliant companies out there putting out some amazing products. And I also think there's a lot of people who have jumped on I wouldn't call it a bandwagon because it's been around for thousands of years, but they've jumped on this recent health craze.
Mm. I mean, just speaking of the that emergence, what is it, do you think? I mean, I know, I mean, there's a bit of a history around psychedelic mushrooms and the suppression of the research around that, where you've had some really, really interesting results with the Stanford experiment, where they were creating some real innovation by the structured application of them, and then it all got clamped down. But that restriction was never in place for functional mushrooms. Why do you think it's just burst onto the scene so powerfully in the last few, I don't know, would say maybe 5 years or maybe 5 to 10 years? Where does that come from?
I do think the psychedelic mushrooms have a big role to play. There's been certain figures who have that crossover from the functional mushrooms and the psychedelic mushrooms, figures like Paul Stamets, Merlin Sheldrake, the book Entangled Life, the documentary Fantastic Fungi. So I don't think it's any surprise that with the rise of psychedelic therapy using magic mushrooms, then you would have this rise in people exploring all different areas of fungi. And
Mm,
it's interesting to note because mycology as an actual discipline seems to be decreasing. There's a lot of aging people in the mycology field who aren't necessarily around so much anymore. And there's not, with that, the accessibility of studying at a university or accessible courses for people who don't have pre-existing backgrounds in biology or other scientific disciplines. So there could be more done on an academic side of things, but there seems to be more of that push now. And I guess as well, maybe it's post-COVID malaise where
mm.
people have been stuck inside quite a lot. They haven't been connected to nature enough, and they might have been on screens for too long. They haven't actually been exercising their brains enough. So now we are really needing these functional mushrooms, and maybe it's not a coincidence that they've come in and they've gained a lot of popularity after a big global crisis, which seems to turn the world upside down. And now mushrooms might be here to sort everything out.
That's really interesting. I hadn't made that connection. It's such a good point. It does surprise me when you say that mycology as a discipline is waning, perhaps. And one of the, if I think about what is happening here in Sweden, we have a lot of clear cutting of the forests, and it's something that we're doing a campaign to raise the yeah, to spread some education around that and to look at, okay, when you clear cut, you look at that from a carbon capture perspective, um, which is how it's normally presented. And they say, well, the forest, it takes 8 to 9 years for the forest to recover from clear cutting, which I want to see the science behind a statement like that. It seems like it would take decades,
Mm,
but also how does it affect the fungal networks, right? What is happening under the ground when the clear cutting takes place? And we do know that emissions from carbon stored under the ground rise sharply for several decades after clear cutting has been done. So there are so many angles to this, and it's the web of life that supports all of us, right? It's so fundamental to biodiversity and so many. It's like a pillar of life, really. And we're still needing to educate people on, well, mushrooms aren't plants, that
mm.
fungi are their own realm. Um, and kind of connected to that educational effort, what role do you think that decentralized communities like Mycelium Hub can play in educating people around, um, yeah, functional mushrooms and other applications for mushrooms? And we've got something called mycelial life hacks, which is a collection of habits and changes that people can make in their life. And part of that is, include adaptogens. We mentioned reishi in there. We're not linking to a specific product, but we're just trying to raise awareness of, hey, here are some changes that you can make in order to create a breakthrough in your life. Maybe raise your energy levels, or maybe, as you pointed out before, maybe make it easier to form new positive habits. Um, what's your take on, you know, when we're trying to educate people? What's some guidance you could give there to help put this on people's radar, and some do's and don'ts, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point because it is looking at how can we as a community overall look at our health. And I think the more that people can have conversations about what's working for them, what's not working for them, I think it's unfortunately we get into the stage of being quite private about our health. And I understand that, but I think the more we can engage in things that you're doing, like events where people are actually coming together and understanding and having knowledge sharing surrounding things like functional mushrooms, then having events where people can try and taste them and experience them. I'm running some events in Brighton where I'm going to be working with a breathwork instructor who looks at breathwork and ADHD and focus, and we're going to be looking at how we can combine mushrooms and breathwork together. So bringing people together in a way that we can experience, taste, smell, and then reflect and really take into account what's happening. How do we feel when
Mm,
we're around other people? What's going on with our interconnectedness? And the more that I'm so glad to have connected with you guys because the energy that you have is a model for where things could really go of bringing people together, of trying to champion each other's strengths. And I think going back to the mycelial web, seeing where the resources are really needed, having that ability to take the time with people, understand where they're coming from, understand what their story is, understand where they want to go, and how we can help support each other. So
mm.
I think the more that people are doing events, I'm really into events because I think it creates a lot of excitement and emergence, which I know you guys are really into. And if you can build it around the excitement of doing something with functional mushrooms, then that sparks more interest and makes people want to be more educated. And then that, in theory, would create a better overall system of wellness because people are more empowered with knowledge.
Great points. I think that, I mean, we've had about 300 people coming through here in the Mycelium Hub, Sweden, and a lot of them struggle with sleep, just getting healthy sleep every night. And I know that there are, for example, reishi that can help with that. Um, so we've kind of combined all of those people's insights and what they do into our guide. Um, but it's really listening to you. I get that it's about communication, really, that it's about the way that we create mycelial exchange and a mycelial support structure is around education. And one of the points that we make with Mycelium Hub is get really clear on what you have to offer, and asking people, hey, what do you bring? What's the value that you bring? What are you passionate about? How can you help people? And then also, what do you need? How can people support your work? How can people engage with you? And I think there are certain types of communication that we can install as habits and that we can model at such in-person events. I'm super excited about the combination of functional mushrooms and breath work. Um, and, I really look forward to hearing about what people got out of that. I'm sure it's going to be super interesting. There are probably a lot of practices. There are probably, I know that you're a Tai Chi practitioner, if I got that right. There's meditation, right? And so there's all these combinations of established practices and then bringing mushrooms into that. Um, what have you, is there one or two, are there a few techniques in your mind that help us um, connect with each other in that decentralized way? We've talked about um, offers and needs. Is there anything else that we should be communicating to each other when we're at these events, when we're in person?
I think communicating the vulnerabilities, communicating the challenges that we found maybe in that the real practical physical sense. I think a lot of the time we think about everything in an organizational structure. How are we organizing? What are we doing to fix XYZ? And a lot of the time, this is what I found personally, there's stumbling blocks because the actual physical shell which is needed to do all the organization isn't actually up to speed. So trying to facilitate where it is we can garner that support from a physical point of view and understand where the limitations are, and um, how we can communicate in that physical sense. It's not necessarily something we are always aware of so much, but um,
It's not something we're uh, let's say taught at school to be, really open and vulnerable about, as you're saying, here are my challenges also, so that we can understand each other and go, oh, um, maybe even just in order to say, I'm actually really good at that. Like maybe I can mentor you, and
mm,
that's something that we have been doing even online is just getting people to open up and say, "Hey, I'm really weak in this area of my life, and um, can someone support me in that?" And so then that allows that connection, could be mentoring, or a
mm.
conversation perhaps to take place. Can I ask you what is your vision in terms of, what's the good future of people accessing mushrooms of all kind, be they psychedelic, functional, or nutritional? Like, how do you see society making the most of mushrooms? Do you have some kind of vision for that, or is there some kind of place that you think we should be moving toward?
I would like to see more physical spaces opening up for engaging with mushrooms. This is something else that I've been talking to someone about potentially creating in Brighton, where it is a mushroom cafe slash advice center, educational space for workshops, where there's a sense of demystifying the mushrooms, of getting more quote unquote ordinary people growing mushrooms, getting into schools where you're able to teach children about the benefits of mushrooms, where you're able to get involved with things like local government, starting campaigns where what I think are quite necessary organisms to be having in our lives, for really taking control of our health, particularly in places like the UK, where there's a lot of health problems that might be fixed with a wide variety of mushrooms. And as much as that sounds a bit gung ho evangelical, I do think there's something crucial missing, where actually, if people started to think about their health in this fungal way, in terms of their gut microbiome, active compounds, stress, sleep, cognition, that could potentially build all these pillars for eating healthily and making better choices surrounding food and exercise. And I think because people lack a lot of those foundations, it's really difficult to make the right kind of choices. So I see mushrooms being almost in a uh, like taking over the world in essence. But I think there's certain avenues for everyone. We're seeing a lot happening in the psychotherapeutic space with magic mushrooms, and as much as I think there are some difficulties there, there's a lot of benefit to be gained from using these mushrooms in that strictly therapeutic sense, where you might not be someone who is interested in the wider mycelial web, and that's okay. And I think it's understanding that there is something for everyone and not trying to push a certain agenda, but really opening up spaces to ask,
Mm.
what is it that you're interested in, and how can mushrooms line up with that?
That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that. I feel like we're really aligned in that vision. With what we're doing here in Sweden, we're also Um, we have been doing that as just introducing people to the magic of mushrooms, even as simple as just going out and finding some boletus mushrooms, which
Mm,
grow here in copious amounts. And the future vision being if we expand that and we have a dedicated building for growing mushrooms and having a mushroom lab so people can actually be here longer term doing research. And yeah, allowing people to have those encounters. They don't necessarily know what to expect, but then when they're here, we'll pull out the chaga and show them, and people are fascinated, right? And they're like, wow, they can really play and discover. And I love that. I love that idea of having more spaces where people can interact with different aspects of that. And through that, they can be led to other things. Through functional, they can be led to psychedelic or through or to the idea of mycelial ways of connecting with each other and exchanging resources. In that spirit, can I ask you, is there something that you're looking for in your work, or are there ways that people can support you, or are there connections that you're looking for as you do this educational task? Um,
yeah, absolutely. I'm looking for more spaces where I can interact with people who have some kind of organizational structure that could benefit from utilizing functional mushrooms. So, running workshops for people who want to understand, okay, we're trying to focus on this task at hand. How could we benefit from using something like lion's mane or cordyceps? How could we all get essentially on the same page, functioning wise, using mushrooms? And then, as I said, I have this upcoming toolkit looking for companies to support that, get involved. If you're a mushroom company, I'm always looking for collaboration within the educational space, webinars, courses, that stuff I'm working on at the moment with different people. So if there are people within that wider functional mushroom space, or companies that are, if you have a brand that is thinking of moving into functional mushrooms and you want to develop a product, having some consultations to understand, okay, what is the best way to develop that? Where can you kind of direct things to make sure that you're getting the highest quality?
okay, wow. What's your main online home? And we'll put some links in the podcast notes. But where's the main place that people can come to you and find out more about your work or engage you in some way?
Yeah, so my website is thefungiconsultant.com,
Yeah.
and it's got links to social media, LinkedIn as well. I'm quite active on, but that's my website.
Yeah, great. Yeah, you're super active on LinkedIn, and
Yeah.
it's really good to see people responding. And you bring up a lot of stuff that can ruffle feathers as well. And I love to see that. It's like you're questioning one of the topics was the default alcohol at events. That when people come together, they have alcoholic drinks, and does it always need to be the case? And some people got
Mhm.
kind of annoyed with that, and so it
Yeah,
was it
yeah.
was really interesting to see. I think it's so important to kind of stir things up and question things, not just to cause a disturbance, but to really question people's long-held assumptions. And I've also been on a journey of changing my relationship with alcohol, where now I'm not a teetotaler, but it's very rare that I drink it, where I had this default mindset of like, oh, it's Friday, let's have a few drinks. And that's part of the personal growth journey. It's dropping things that don't serve us. It's really looking at that and going, do I really need to get kind of half drunk every week? Like, does that help me, or what does that
Mm,
do to me? So it's mindful living. We haven't included that in the mycelial life hacks. It's just kind of a by the way thing, but it's
sure.
not a specific thing of like drop alcohol from your life. But I can definitely say personally that it's made a big impact, and it's really helped me. That clarity, when you leave that behind, you can see um, how it's affected you in the past. Um,
Yeah.
is there yeah, like I mean, even people in my team, all of us at mycelium Hub have actually gone on that journey, and it's been really beneficial.
Brilliant.
Um, is You made a comment earlier about people's approach to psychedelics and how you'd like to see that maybe change. Am I getting that right? Or do you want to just comment on that? Like, how are people approaching that, and what could they do instead? Do you want to maybe talk to that a
Y-
little?
Yeah, I think we're in a difficult situation with psychedelics where the psychotherapeutic angle is gaining a lot of precedence. It seems to be the dominant narrative that the world is in a complete health crisis, complete mental health crisis, and we need to desperately solve these problems of PTSD and depression and anxiety. And I do think we need alternative treatments to manage mental health. I don't necessarily know for certain if it is as desperate as a lot of the, let's call it, corporate psychedelic space would like to make out. Going back to my, just feelings towards mycelium, it's all very slow and it's careful and it's a process which takes a long time. Now, people might say, well, people have been working on trying to get psychedelics legalized and medicalized for 20 years, and it's not a quick process. But actually the paradigm that's been entered into has been quite quick, in the sense of we can't access these substances, therefore we need to make them medical in order to access them, and eventually it will have a trickle down effect. And that might be true. That seems to have somewhat been the case with cannabis in the US, even though it's still federally against the law to consume and possess it. So I do worry that, okay, if we talk in terms of psilocybin as a molecule for managing mental health, rather than engaging with an experience of magic mushrooms, which connects you to nature like you've never been connected before, and as a byproduct of that, your mental health improves. It's a different
Mm.
story. So, and perhaps I'm being magical and naive in thinking that we should have this intimate connection with mushrooms. But I often think, and I don't know if this is maybe somewhat neurodivergent thinking, but I often think, what would the mushroom say if it could talk? If we could interview a mushroom and say, how do you feel about what's happening when people are trying to extract you and turn you into a molecule and patent you and make lots of money in a way that is still within the human paradigm, still within this problem solution narrative. And I don't think it's as simple. And I think the mushroom might say, oh, have you thought about maybe doing things more in this mycelial way? It it seems like the world wants to get everyone onto psychedelics. We need to fix everyone. Everyone needs to have that experience themselves. And if we're looking at shamanic practices, it might be that maybe we only need a few people to have these experiences. And then, if in an ideal society, maybe we could bring these experiences back and share them with people. But because we're in this space where we don't necessarily believe the experience unless we've had it ourselves, it falls into this, I guess, wider scope of kind of the pharmaceutical industrial complex, where people really do believe, okay, we have to talk in the narratives which appease the existing paradigms in order to get any access. Whereas I have a slightly more radical stance, which is I would rather just see these laws repealed and people be able to access, grow these substances themselves, because I don't think we would end up in a chaotic situation where everyone is being totally irresponsible. I mean, maybe that will happen, but I feel like if we keep talking in terms of the pharmaceutical narrative, we're giving in to all of the uh, unnecessary fears surrounding psychedelics. There should be some
Mm.
careful use and caveats, but not all of this fear.
I really love the idea of putting myself into the position of the mushroom and saying, what would the mushroom advise? And it reminds me of this practice that the indigenous Sami have here in Sweden and Norway, and I think they're in Finland as well. And when they're having uh, meetings to decide about matters to do with the community or deciding about the future, they will leave a seat for nature. And so they'll have one seat for nature and they'll have one for the animals. And that is to remind everyone, you know, there's another perspective that we should be considering here. And it's also related to the idea of doing things in a way that you're considering 7 generations down the line from Native American. I believe, there's also this when you look at older traditions of psychedelic use, there was, I believe, a container, and I don't know where I got the idea from or whether it's just a myth or something, but this idea of the whole community comes together for a full moon ritual, and then people take certain substances, and the ego dissolves, and conflicts get brought up and dealt with. And, there's this idea of a unifying ceremony that is probably led by a shaman. But you have this container of village society that sits within, and there's a regular cycle to that, whether it's the new moon or something, or the full moon or something else. And we tend not to have that when we're living in cities and we have these kind of somewhat disconnected lives, as you were referring to before. But
Yeah,
I mean, isn't it exciting to be in this space and to be involved in giving shape to where this all moves?
absolutely. It's not a space that I've necessarily consistently been in, and I think that's testament to uh, maybe having done other things or left the country and gone traveling, and then feeling this draw to always come back in. And I've had some. I've got a friend who's a psychedelic integration therapist, and they're not really involved in the wider psychedelic space. And they asked me why is it that what is it that keeps you in there? And I wasn't really sure. It's some magic and excitement and enchantment and the ability to talk to people about the compounds within functional mushrooms, and then also talk about things related to consciousness and what it means to be a human, all of these questions which excite us. And yeah, it's not an easy space to be in a lot of the time.
Yeah.
It requires um, a lot of navigation, and I do think it is quite energetically driven. I do just there's people I just resonate with, and that is a real thing that keeps me within this space, is the connections I make.
Right. So that's very intuitive and that's very kind of super rational or super rational perhaps.
Yeah, yeah,
And from connecting to the work of Mycelium Hub, we're in touch with a lot of people that are facing uncertainty and doubt about where they are in their career or in their life, and they're looking to step into a more authentic existence. And that's part of why we've loved to have you on here on this podcast is I see you as an example of someone who's always gone for um, what makes sense intuitively, that you've gone for something to say, no, I'm not going to be an accountant in an office. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it's like that isn't me. I'm going to go into this space, even though it's difficult, even though it's weird, and it's going to require me to grow. And I don't know the answers. I don't know. There's no template for what you're doing and for who you're being. But I salute you for the bravery and stepping out and being an example in that beyond what you teach around functional mushrooms and psychedelics, that you're actually just being an example of someone living really an authentic life.
Well, thank you. And I have done I've done my fair share of office jobs that have been quite unfulfilling, and it's taken me what feels like a lot of time and more time maybe than it should have done to have that confidence to actually say, do you know what, that feeling that I get, there's two feelings. There's the feeling of being in a job that's really unfulfilling and having to displace whatever it might be because, okay, on the weekend I get to do this or I get to have a holiday. And actually, now there's the feeling of joy and excitement of engaging with things that I'm passionate about. And I'm not thinking, God, this is so boring. I can't wait to have a holiday. It's more, this is exciting and I get to actually be involved in this space. What a treat to be someone who, and there's not, the space isn't that big and there's quite a lot of people in the world. So it really is what a treat, and having that gratitude and feeling
Mm,
like I get to be able to have these conversations. I get to have lots of meetings where I'm networking with people where it might not go anywhere, but all it might be might just be a connection to share some ideas and resonate with another
mm,
human being in a different country. And isn't that a wonderful thing? And I wouldn't have that opportunity if I was in an office job just doing
mm,
something, whatever it might be that I'm not interested in.
mm. You can branch out freely, right? You can like
Mm,
move forward with courage and connected to intuition. And
mm,
um, I really can, I understand where you're coming from with that. And that's a lot of how we work as well. Of you make connections, you just know, hey, these people should be connected with each other in the same way that the mycelium is traversing the ground and connecting and reaching out and going, oh, here's something that needs to be connected to
mm.
everything else that I'm connected to. And you don't know what's going to happen. It's kind of magical in that way. Of course, it'd be great to see you in Sweden, and
Absolutely.
if the opportunity arises, we'd love to have you here and
Mm.
go continue all of these wonderful conversations.
Yes.
And we'll be at All Things Fungi Festival, where we'll definitely connect over there um,
Yeah.
in September. And yeah, we'll have a kind of thinking like mycelium workshop where it's kind of taking this mycelial thinking and putting a practical slant onto it, kind of along the lines of what we've discussed here. Like, what are some of the things we can communicate to each other
Mm.
in order to create this mutual support? Um, and so it's going to be exciting to be over there and connect with a lot of mycelium and fungal people.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a great festival. Really, just awesome vibes, and I think you'll have a great time.
yeah, well, Andrew went over there and
Yeah.
connected with a whole lot of people, and I give credit to him for connecting you to Mycelium Hub, and that was
Yeah, yeah.
some
It
great
was it
work.
was quite interesting just to have someone come up to me and say, I don't know why, but I get the feeling like we should connect. And that I'd not necessarily had that kind of experience before, so it was very refreshing.
Yeah, it's great, and look where it's developed, and I
Absolutely.
think it,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know, well, let's see where the journey goes.
for sure.
And
It's
also,
fantastic.
thanks to Marcia for producing in the background and getting everything set up. I know there's a lot of work that goes into a podcast and a production like this to make sure the sound is right and the lights
Yeah,
right and the room the rooms arranged in the proper way. So I give
yeah,
thanks and I appreciate her for doing that. What are there any final thoughts you want to share, Ollie, before we close and wrap up the podcast?
I would say don't be scared to be a myco geek. It's, as I said, it seems to be a dying field, but I really think that there's a lot of information, but I don't think it's that complex. And I think do what you can to really get to grips with the information because the more you read about it, I promise you, the more you'll get excited about these mushrooms and really understand what they can do for you.
Amazing. That's certainly been our experience also. And the more we get into it, the more we're fired up and the more excited we are to also share this knowledge. So thank you so much for
Thank you, Milan.
being on the podcast with us. I really enjoyed this, and
Yeah, same
I've
here.
certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure our listener also will.
Well, thank you.